When World War I erupted due to German actions, one of their strategic aims was to anticipate that the citizens of their allied nations might abandon their respective homelands during this challenging time. However, this assumption proved to be a significant miscalculation. Even in a conflict known for numerous enemy misjudgments, the British colonies, in particular, displayed remarkable solidarity with Great Britain, earning enduring acclaim for their unwavering support. Canada, in particular, sent an impressive contingent to aid in the war effort. These brave individuals underwent rigorous training, enduring harsh winter conditions before departing for the front lines. Their journey led them to engage in some of the most intense and lethal battles of the entire campaign, notably the conflict at St. Julian Village, near the renowned Hill 60, where numerous troops heroically thwarted German attempts to advance toward Calais. The Germans, in their desperation, resorted to the nefarious tactic of poison gas. This account, narrated by Lance Corporal R.G. Simmons of the 8th Battalion Canadian Infantry, 90th Winnipeg Rifles, details how even this tactic ultimately failed.
When I recall my experiences at the front, I am particularly struck by the circumstance that the thing which stands out most clearly in my mind is not the actual campaigning, not the long and weary times in the trenches, not even artillery, rifle, or bayonet work, but the coming of the poison gas. I myself was gassed in the furious fighting at St. Julian. I will get right at things quickly. Towards the end of April, the Canadian Division was holding a line near Ypres, which was not far short of 3 miles in extent. That line ran northwest from Paul Capel, Passchendaele Road, and at the end joined up with the French. 3 infantry brigades with artillery comprised the division, the first being in reserve, the second on the right of the third, and the third connecting with the French. We were in the salient of Ypres, which was known to be weak, but the holding of which was of vast importance. I am proud to think that I am one of the Canadian contingent to whom the big task of keeping back the German hosts at that point was given, and that I fought with men who gave their lives in stopping the German attempt to hack a way through to Calais, so as to have a very near blow at England. Placed as we were placed, it was possible to see the battle being fought on 3 sides, and this was uncommonly interesting. We were, of course, in trenches, quite near the Germans, but between us there ran a ridge which is known as a hogback, so that there was a somewhat formidable natural barrier between the opposing forces. We were so near to the famous Hill 60 that we heard the explosion there and the subsequent battle when we were in billets at Ypres. The hill had been mined with 6 or 7 tons of dynamite, the explosion of which was enough to change even the appearance of the hill. There was a fine smart affair on the night of April 17th, when about a mile of German trenches was taken, and I saw about 2,000 German prisoners being escorted away. Their uniforms were shabby, and their equipment was not what it ought to have been, but the men themselves appeared to be remarkably fit and well cared for. We had gone into the trenches after marching through Ypres, where the chimney pots were tumbling about our ears, and we were expecting very hot times. But the hogback prevented us from seeing the Germans, and of course kept us out of their sight. But there were German snipers everywhere, and they took good care to harass us. At charge of a section of bomb throwers, and we did our best to hurl these strange but quite legitimate weapons at the enemy. At first the bombs were homely contrivances, made of jam tins filled with explosives. But later they were made under War Office control, and were far superior to the primitive articles which we manufactured ourselves. In such a war, and in such a place, it is not easy to tell of what was done by individuals, because so many splendid acts are unobserved, but I call to mind the coolness and resource of my own platoon officer, Lieutenant MacLeod. He was dashing all over the place, encouraging his men at every point, and doing things all round in fine style. I was talking to him quite a lot in the thick of things, and was specially struck by his calmness and the wonderful effect his example had upon the men. One outstanding performance of his was to run, in broad daylight, from battalion headquarters to the trenches, a pretty brave achievement, when you bear in mind that a running man presents an almost certain target to snipers. In this connection, I call to mind the case of a section commander who was in a trench. He wished that a certain thing should be done, and by way of indicating his desire, he held up his hand, with palm extended. That must have been a small enough target, in all conscience, but it was no sooner in the air than it was pierced by 5 German bullets. If a hand can be so effectively fired at, what chance to escape has the body of a man? This trench warfare was uncommonly exhausting. You never knew what was going to happen, or what you would be called upon to do, but it was astonishing to find how soon you could adapt yourself to circumstances. I recall an occasion when we had been forced to retire at one point and get into a communication trench. We were taken aback by the discovery that it was not deep enough. We had to dig ourselves in. That was not a hard matter for the boys who had their entrenching tools, but I had lost mine, and the only thing left to do was to try rabbit tactics. So I began to dig myself in with my fingers, and I have a distinct recollection of tearing and scooping at the ground like an animal scuttling for shelter. Luckily, the ground was soft and yielding, or I should not have had a chance with such poor tools. As it was, my fingers were torn and bleeding long before the digging in process was completed. I have given you a general understanding of the task that fell to the Canadian contingent to accomplish, but as I have said, it is not the actual fighting that dwells in one's memory. We soon settled down to the ordinary ways of war, and took them as a matter of course. While in training in England we had heard and read a good deal about the fighting, and had become accustomed to it. While, as for any such discomforts as heavy rain and sodden ground, they did not trouble us. Not even Flanders could give us worse trials of this sort than we had known while wintering on Salisbury Plain. The boys took the fighting and the hardships as part of the day's work, and there was neither grumbling nor protesting, but that state of things was changed like magic when there was sprung upon us the most cowardly, dastardly, and dirty means of fighting that the world has ever known. This was the use of poison gas by the Germans, a device which instantly put them out of consideration as civilized combatants, and stamped them forever as dishonorable soldiers of a dishonored country. This poison gas came upon us unseen, insidiously, and without the slightest warning in the one case, and in the other it rolled down upon us literally as a cloud. It is hard to speak calmly of this unprecedented form of warfare, but I will try to tell exactly what happened, and I think I can do that because when I was a medical student, I particularly interested myself in chemistry. It was on Saturday the 24th that our brigade had their first experience of gas. We had been shelling the German trenches all day, and were standing to, expecting an attack by the enemy. We naturally looked for the employment of the usual methods, and were ready to receive the Germans when they showed themselves. We were strongly entrenched, and many a keen eye was kept on the hostile ground, watching for the appearance of the enemy. But not a sight of a German was to be had. There was no commotion, no excitement, no appearance of anything uncanny or uncommon, yet there was coming towards us a German weapon which was neither honest artillery nor small arms, poison gas. There was nothing to be seen in the air, yet suddenly, and without any apparent cause, we were overpowered by a smell exactly like nasturtium, but infinitely stronger and more pungent. The similarity noticed is remarkable, for doesn't nasturtium come from Latin words which really mean a nose twister? Anyway, there we were in our trenches, unexpectedly overpowered by a horrible acrid smell and an invisible gas. A lot of the boys, fine, splendid, honest fellows who did not understand the meaning of any kind of warfare that is not honourable and above-board, were utterly unable to fathom the mystery, and they seemed to think that it was the kind of pest that had to be taken with the other discomforts of campaigning in the Low Country. "What the deuce is it?" they asked. It was not until the whole unspeakable visitation was over that most of the men realized what had happened, and that the Germans had tried to blind us as a preliminary to annihilation. Like so many more of the German hopes, this did not develop on the lines that had been planned. This was the first poison gas attack that we experienced, and I am thankful to say that on the whole it was a failure. But when you remember that we were utterly unready for such a filthy form of fighting, and that we had no means of combating it or nullifying its effects, you will realize the extreme disadvantage of a contest from the point of view of the Canadians. I have said that it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when we had our first experience of the poison gas. Now that I am talking of the thing, it strikes me as a strange coincidence that it was at about 4 o'clock in the morning when we had our second visitation. We had got into our stride and settled down to hard hammering and what you might call routine campaigning. Then came the morning of Saturday, April 24th, when the sun rose 10 minutes before 5 o'clock, which means that at about 4 o'clock day was breaking. Most of us were asleep, But in wartime, there is no such thing as universal rest for men, and our sentries were posted and keeping watchful eyes upon the German line. It is said that the darkest hour comes just before the dawn, and I think there is no doubt that man's lowest vitality is reached at that particular period. At any rate, the Germans probably thought so, for they planned a specially fatal attack upon us in the grey hours of this April morning. While looking round in the cheerless dawn, one or two of our sentries saw a yellowish kind of cloud coming towards us over the hogback and travelling pretty fast. The sight was unusual enough to be noticed, but no one who saw it had the slightest idea what it really was, until we were enveloped in the filthy folds. Then we knew that it was poison gas. The cloud rolled on, and as it got quite close to us, I noticed that it was about 8 feet or 12 feet high, a deep, dense yellow at the bottom, and becoming lighter towards the top, so diffuse indeed that it was almost indistinguishable from the atmosphere. It is not easy exactly to convey an understanding of what the cloud really was, because few men have ever seen anything like it, but it might well be described as a moving mass of yellow, fat filth, insufferably loathsome. The poison, gas, the chief constituent of which I took to be chlorine, was about twice as heavy as air, and, consequently, it travelled along the surface of the ground. I saw the yellow cloud come, I watched it as it enveloped us, and I observed it as it rolled away behind us and went towards Ypres, gradually losing force as it was absorbed in the air. In addition to being so favourably situated, we had just had a rum rash, and plenty of it. I do not know whether the spirit did us any good, but it certainly did not do us the least harm, and may have helped to nullify the effects of the poison gas. Our salient, vulnerable, and undoubtedly attractive to the Germans, was rushed by them, and they succeeded in breaking through and occupying a trench about 100 yards away from our own and parallel with it. They came on with wonderful steadiness, advancing just as if they were on parade, scarcely breaking step at all. They came out of their trenches about a dozen at a time, formed 2 long lines, and literally seemed to walk over into the trench, though we were peppering at them all the time. They kept up an excellent covering fire, with the result that a good many of our own men were shot. This was fair, open fighting, the sort of thing that a soldier expects, and into the spirit of which he can enter. It gave opportunities, too, for the display of the best qualities of warfare, and these were shown by a man I knew very well, Company Sergeant, Major F.W. Hall of my company. In spite of a very heavy and at that time fatal fire, the sergeant Major rushed out from the shelter of his trench to bring in a wounded man who was lying in the open. He seemed to bear a charmed life, for he got clear of the trench and was untouched by the fire of the trench, and was untouched by the fire of the enemy. The sergeant major managed by good fortune, which seemed miraculous, to get as far as the wounded man. He seized him and started with his burden for safety. In fact, he actually got him as far as the trench. Then, when the worst seemed over and security was just within his reach, when he was getting over the parapet and men were loudly cheering him because of his success, he was shot and killed. But the uncommon courage of the action had been noticed, and later on, to the real gratification of all the Canadians, and especially those who knew him, the announcement was made that the dead hero had been awarded the Victoria Cross. Hall's men were terribly shattered by the enemy's rifle and machine-gun fire, but in spite of it all, they held their ground, and the living remnant won great glory. It was not long before I dropped. I did not recover till the fight had swept away to my right. Then I reported to an artillery officer who was near, and he showed me the way to Ypres, telling me also to go into the city for hospital treatment. I cannot close my yarn without mention of Captain Northwood's company. 4. The company was not relieved. It could not be because of the heavy call on troops, but it fought on doggedly till 2 platoons were captured, yet there were no prisoners made except at a bitter cost to the Germans. There were many heroes that day in 4 Company. I cannot name them all, but I must mention 2 of them who stand out preeminent: Boxcar Kelly, now a King's Corporal, and Corporal Sanford. Kelly did everything in his power to rally some of the British troops who were near him, while Sanford, a section commander, did as much by his example of splendid courage as any officer I know. That is my story. If space permitted, I might tell of Corporal Dagan and his gallant band of hand grenaders, how they bravely fought when hemmed in by the enemy, of Lieutenant Owens, who stood with an automatic pistol in each hand, cheering and swearing in the same breath, defending his comrades and destroying the Germans, of Sergeant Nobel, now a captain, who repaired a telephone wire under an annihilating cannonade from German guns, and a score of other splendid fellows who utterly forgot themselves and their extremity, and risked their all upon the hazard of the glorious common cause.